Hey everyone, and welcome to our deep dive. We're going to be exploring Edwin Abbott's Flatland.
Flatland.
Such a fascinating world he creates.
Yes, it is.
And we have excerpts here to really delve deep into it, specifically looking at how the Flatlanders perceive their world and their very rigid societal structure.
Yeah.
And, of course, the protagonist's journey to a higher dimension. I mean, who doesn't love
Right.
a good dimension-hopping story?
Well, what's fascinating about Flatland is it's not just a mathematical puzzle. It's really a sharp, satirical commentary on Victorian society. It just cleverly disguised as a story about, geometric shapes living in two dimensions.
Right. It's pretty wild to think about.
Yeah.
Just living in a world where you can only see straight lines.
Right.
It really makes you question.
Yeah.
Like, how much are we limited by our own perception?
Absolutely. And, Abbott uses this simple but brilliant premise to explore some really profound questions about social hierarchy.
Yes.
The limitations of perception, and that potential for individual growth.
Let's paint a picture of this flatland society. I mean, it's all about sides and angles.
It is.
Right. The more sides you have, the higher up on that social ladder you are.
Yes.
So you've got the lines at the bottom.
Right.
Then you've got your triangles, squares, pentagons.
All the way up to those circles.
All the way up to the elite circles.
Yes.
It's a real social pecking order based on geometry.
It is. And the more sides you have, the more refined and intelligent you're perceived to be. A not so subtle jab at the Victorian class system, wouldn't you say?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Totally.
Yeah.
But here's where I think it gets really interesting.
Okay.
There's this law of nature where male children usually gain one more side than their fathers.
Right.
So there's this built-in potential for upward mobility.
There is, but of course there are exceptions, right?
Oh, of course.
Tradesmen. Soldiers might be able to climb that social ladder through hard work, intelligence, but the system clearly favors those born into privilege.
Right. It's like the deck is stacked from the start.
Exactly, it is, yeah.
And you can't forget that hilarious anecdote about the speaker's ancestor who accidentally bumped into a high-ranking polygon and because of his rheumatism caused a social catastrophe that set his family back for generations.
It's brilliant, right?
I know.
Talk about a bad day at the office.
Oh, talk about a bad day at the office.
Really?
So we've got this rigid social hierarchy based on sides.
Yes.
But then there are the women. And this is where things get
Oh, boy.
really interesting and a bit disturbing.
Yes.
They're depicted as straight lines
Light lines.
and are considered incredibly dangerous because of their sharp ends.
It's a stark reflection of those Victorian anxieties about women and their perceived power, seen as both vulnerable and threatening, needing constant control, surveillance.
It's mind-boggling.
It is.
They have to constantly emit peace cries so people know they're approaching.
Right.
Their movements are restricted.
Yes.
And there are even laws that could lead to their instant death.
I mean, these laws, while presented in this fantastical setting, really mirror the real restrictions placed on women in Victorian England. I mean, their lives were dictated by societal expectations and a constant fear of their perceived potential to just disrupt the order.
It's like they're walking on a tightrope.
Yes.
All the time.
Yeah.
Trying to not set off any alarms.
Right.
And then get this, they can appear practically invisible when seen end on.
Oh, gosh.
Which makes things even more dangerous for everyone involved.
That invisibility adds another layer to Abbott's satire. So women are both hyper-visible with their sharp ends.
Yeah.
And potentially invisible, highlighting the complex and contradictory way they were perceived in Victorian society. They are feared and controlled, yet simultaneously dismissed and overlooked.
So we've got this world where everyone is a shape.
Everyone's a shape.
And they're constantly judging each other based on their number of sides.
Right.
But how do they actually recognize each other if everyone looks like a line?
That's where things get really clever. Abbott introduces these three methods of recognition, and each one is tied to social class.
Okay, so spill the tea.
All right.
So how did these Flatlanders figure out who's who?
Okay, so for the lower classes, it's all about hearing.
Okay.
They have incredibly sensitive hearing and can distinguish voices, even social ranks.
Wow.
But as you move up the social ladder, things get trickier.
So the elite wouldn't be caught dead using their ears?
Precisely. The higher classes have more nuanced voices, harder to distinguish by ear alone.
Okay.
Plus, voice discrimination is considered a plebeian virtue, far too crude for the refined sensibilities of the upper classes.
So what do? Tap dance their way through introductions?
Something like that. They resort to feeling.
Okay.
Literally touching each other's angles to determine their shape and their social standing.
Wait, seriously? Can you imagine that at like a fancy Flatland cocktail party? Excuse me, Mr. Hexagon, while I just feel up your angles to make sure you're really you.
Right.
I mean, it sounds absurd, but
it does.
Such a clever way to comment on, social rituals.
And just like with those peace cries, there's a whole set of rules and etiquette around feeling to avoid accidental stabbings.
Right.
A misplaced touch could be fatal, especially with those sharp women around.
It's like a deadly game of geometric twister.
It is.
But for the real elite, the top tier of Flatland society, there's an even more sophisticated method.
Yeah.
Sight recognition.
Sight recognition. Now, this is where Abbott really gets into the mathematical nitty-gritty.
Okay.
Remember, Flatlanders can only see straight lines.
Right.
But they can detect subtle differences in brightness and shading to discern the shape of a polygon.
So they're basically deciphering geometry in real time.
Exactly.
Like a super-powered version of those magic eye posters.
Exactly. It takes years of training and practice, and it's considered the most refined method of recognition. Further solidifying that link between knowledge and social status, feeling, is seen as crude and outdated compared to the intellectual prowess of sight recognition.
So you got to be pretty sharp.
You do.
Literally and figuratively.
Yeah.
To make it in Flatland.
To make it in Flatland.
That's right. But even with all these systems in place, things must still get pretty chaotic sometimes, right?
Well, there was a time when things really got shaken up. It's a period in Flatland's history called the Color Revolt.
Ooh, color. Tell me more about that.
Imagine a world where color, something we take for granted, is suddenly introduced and throws everything into disarray. That's what happened in Flatland. It was a time of social upheaval and chaos as people grappled with this new way of perceiving the world.
So it wasn't just like a fashion statement.
Yeah.
This color thing really
rocked the boat.
Rocked the boat.
Absolutely. Color disrupted those traditional methods of recognition and challenged the established social hierarchy. Suddenly, the old ways of seeing and understanding the world were no longer sufficient. It's a brilliant metaphor for any kind of social change that shakes up the status quo.
It's like throwing a wrench into a perfectly calibrated machine.
It is.
So what do the powers that be think about all this?
Well, just like in the real world, there was resistance,
Yeah.
fear, and attempts to control the impact of color. The book even mentions a cunning scheme to try and manipulate women by associating them with the priestly class through color.
Wow.
But ultimately, the color revolt was suppressed and color was banished from Flatland.
It sounded like a wild time.
It was.
But what about those circles at the top of this geometric pyramid scheme?
Oh, yeah.
They must have been freaking out.
You bet. The circles, those perfect forms shrouded in mystery, represent the pinnacle of Flatland society, almost beyond scrutiny.
Right.
But here's the twist. Despite being called circles, they are, in reality, just polygons with a very large number of sides.
Yeah.
It's like the ultimate illusion of perfection.
It's like those Instagram influencers who filter their photos to achieve this unrealistic image.
Exactly.
You never guess they're just regular polygons underneath it all.
Right, and the book even describes these special gymnasiums where infants are sent for physical manipulation to try and increase their number of sides. Parents are literally risking their children's lives for a chance at higher social status.
It's like a high-stakes geometry lottery.
It is.
But even with all that effort,
Yeah.
the circles are obsessed with configuration, the number of sides, as like the only measure of character and morality.
It's a completely reductionist view of the world, right?
Yeah.
That ignores things like talent, kindness, even basic decency. Abbott is clearly satirizing Victorian ideas about social Darwinism and that belief that your place in society reflects your inherent worth.
And it's so hypocritical.
It is.
Right. They preach about regularity, having perfectly equal sides, but then make terrible choices in marriage, driven by these superficial things like a woman's voice or how bright her lines are.
Their actions completely contradict their supposed enlightenment.
Right.
It's a clear indictment of the hypocrisy of those in power who often fail to live up to the standards they impose on others.
Okay, so we've explored this rigid society where your worth is determined by your shape, and women are both feared and controlled.
Yes.
But now let's get to the really mind-blowing stuff. The protagonist's encounter with a being from Spaceland.
Ooh.
A three-dimensional world.
And this is where the book takes a truly fascinating turn.
Yes.
It explodes the limitations of perception and introduces us to this mind-bending concept of higher dimensions.
I'm ready to have my mind bent. So how does this whole interdimensional meet-cute go down?
So the book describes a sphere, visiting the protagonist and trying to explain the concept of three dimensions.
Okay.
Imagine trying to explain depth to someone who has only ever experienced length and width.
I can barely fold a fitted sheet, let alone wrap my head around another dimension.
Exactly. It's a fundamental shift in understanding that challenges everything the protagonist thought he knew about the world.
Right.
So the sphere uses analogies, demonstrations, anything he can think of to get the message across.
Okay.
But initially, the protagonist just can't grasp it.
I can imagine him just staring blankly like, are you speaking Flatlandish? So how does he finally make the leap from 2 dimensions to 3?
Well, that's a story for our next segment.
All right, cliffhanger.
A cliffhanger.
We'll be right back.
Stay tuned. Welcome back to our deep dive into Flatland.
Yes. We left off on quite the cliffhanger.
We did.
Our poor protagonist was staring blankly at this sphere.
Yeah, he was probably wondering if he'd accidentally ingested some bad squares.
Right, exactly. So how does this sphere, this being from a higher dimension, finally break through to our 2-dimensional friend?
Not with bad squares, thankfully.
Yeah, good.
It's something far more mind-blowing to a Flatlander movement through dimensions. The sphere demonstrates the concept of 3 dimensions by passing through the protagonist's plane of existence.
Wait, hold on. So the sphere basically like phases through the protagonist.
Precisely.
Talk about a close encounter of the dimensional kind.
I know. Imagine you're a Flatlander and you see a circle appear out of thin air.
Right.
Grow larger, then smaller, and then finally vanish.
Oof.
That's what the protagonist experiences as the sphere passes through his world.
I can only imagine the look on his face. It's like witnessing a magic trick, but one that like defies the very laws of his reality.
It's a pivotal moment in the book.
Yes.
The protagonist finally sees with his own eyes evidence of a reality beyond his comprehension. But seeing is just the beginning.
Right.
He still has to make sense of it all.
So does he immediately become a believer, or does he try to rationalize it away?
He definitely struggles at first.
Okay.
You know, he tries to fit what he's seen into his existing framework of understanding. But the experience is so profound, so earth-shattering, that he can't deny the truth any longer.
It's like having your entire worldview shattered and then having to like pick up the pieces and build something new.
Perfect analogy.
Yeah.
And this is where the real philosophical journey begins. The protagonist is forced to grapple with the implications of this higher dimensional reality. What does it mean for his understanding of everything? What does it say about the limits of his own perception and, by extension, ours?
Okay, so let's talk about those implications. What are some of those big aha moments that the protagonist has while hanging out in Spaceland?
One of the most profound is the realization that everything he thought was solid is actually just a surface.
Yeah.
From the perspective of Spaceland, he can see the inside of houses, objects, even other Flatlanders.
Whoa! It's like suddenly having X-ray vision.
Exactly. And this completely challenges his understanding of privacy, security, the very nature of existence. What does it mean to be inside or outside when those concepts are defined by a dimension you can't even perceive?
I can imagine it would be pretty unsettling.
Yeah.
To realize that everything you thought was hidden is actually exposed from a higher dimension. Talk about an existential crisis.
It's a moment of both wonder and terror. The realization that the universe is far vaster and more complex than we can possibly imagine, and our place within it is far more limited than we might like to believe.
So after having this like mind-blowing dimension-hopping experience, our protagonist is probably itching to share his newfound knowledge with everyone back in Flatland. Right? He wants to be like a prophet of the 3rd dimension.
He's filled with this missionary zeal to enlighten his fellow Flatlanders. But, you know, as we discussed earlier, his attempts to share this revolutionary knowledge are met with fear.
Yeah.
Disbelief and outright hostility.
It's classic, isn't it?
Yeah.
The visionary, the one who dares to see beyond the accepted reality, is often rejected and ridiculed by those who cling to the familiar.
Precisely. And this rejection speaks to the deeply ingrained resistance to change that we see throughout history. New ideas, especially those that challenge the established order, are often met with suspicion and hostility.
It's tragic, really. He's punished for trying to expand people's understanding of the universe.
And it highlights the power of social conditioning.
Right.
How easily we can become trapped within the limitations of our own culture and worldview.
It makes you wonder how many, truths do we accept without question simply because they're part of our shared reality? How many possibilities do we dismiss because they don't fit within our current framework of understanding?
Those are questions worth pondering.
They are.
And it's precisely the kind of critical thinking that Abbott encourages in his readers. He wants us to be skeptical,
Right.
to challenge dogma, and to always be open to new perspectives.
So our protagonist is back in Flatland, facing ridicule and rejection.
He is.
But there's another challenge he has to overcome. Right?
Yes.
The problem of language. How do you describe something you've experienced when there are no words for it in your vocabulary?
This is a crucial point. The protagonist struggles to articulate the concept of 3 dimensions using the language of Flatland, which is inherently limited by its 2-dimensional perspective.
It's like trying to explain the color blue to someone who's been blind their entire life.
Exactly.
The words simply don't exist to convey the experience.
Exactly. And this linguistic limitation further isolates the protagonist and makes it even harder for him to share his knowledge.
Okay, so we've talked about the societal structure of Flatland.
Yes.
The protagonist's mind-blowing trip to Spaceland.
Right.
And the challenges he faces when he returns.
Yeah.
But what does it all mean for us, the listeners?
Right.
We're not living in a 2-dimensional world, thankfully.
Thankfully, no.
So what can we take away from all of this?
I think the key takeaway is the importance of questioning our assumptions and being open to the possibility that there might be more to reality than we currently perceive.
Like the idea that there could be higher dimensions beyond our understanding.
Exactly. Just as the Flatlanders couldn't fathom a 3rd dimension, we might be similarly limited by our current scientific and philosophical framework.
It's a humbling thought.
It is.
And a little bit terrifying, too.
Well,
but it also makes you wonder, what other truths are we blindly accepting just because we haven't been exposed to a higher level of understanding?
that's a question worth exploring, and it's precisely the kind of intellectual curiosity that Abbott inspires in his readers.
Well said. Now, before we move on to the final part of our deep dive, I'm curious to hear more about what Abbott tells us about Spaceland itself.
Okay.
What are the inhabitants like?
Yeah.
What's their society like?
Well, one detail that stands out is the Sphere's description of Spaceland inhabitants as being far more advanced than Flatlanders, both intellectually and morally.
So basically, higher dimensions equal higher levels of consciousness.
It's not quite that simple. It's more nuanced than that. The Sphere suggests that the ability to perceive and understand higher dimensions is linked to a greater capacity for knowledge, empathy, and ethical behavior.
It's like they've evolved beyond the petty squabbles and social hierarchies that plague Flatland. They're operating on a whole other level.
Precisely, and this is another important message that Abbott conveys through his story. He's suggesting that true enlightenment requires not just intellectual understanding, but also moral and spiritual growth.
So it's not enough to grasp the concept of higher dimensions. You have to actually live in a way that reflects that expanded awareness.
Exactly, and that's a challenge for all of us, whether we live in Flatland, Spaceland, or our own 3-dimensional world.
I love that. It's a call to action, to not just expand our minds, but also to expand our hearts and our actions in the world.
Absolutely.
Now, before we wrap up this part of our journey, is there anything else you'd like to highlight about the protagonist's experience in Spaceland? Come back to our deep dive into Flatland.
Yes.
Now, before we went on this philosophical tangent, we were discussing the protagonist's time in Spaceland.
Yeah.
And how the inhabitants there seem to have evolved beyond the limitations.
Yes, they have.
And the prejudices of that 2-dimensional world.
It's fascinating how Abbott uses the concept of higher dimensions to explore not just the expansion of knowledge, but also the expansion of consciousness itself.
It's not just about seeing more.
Right.
It's about understanding more, feeling more, being more.
Yes.
But when our protagonist tries to share this expanded view with his fellow Flatlanders, he faces some serious pushback.
He does. It's heartbreaking, really.
It is.
He returns to Flatland filled with enthusiasm, eager to share his incredible experience, only to be met with fear, disbelief, and accusations of heresy.
It's a real case of shooting the messenger.
It is.
He's punished for simply revealing a truth that challenges their, comfortable, limited view of reality.
And it speaks to a deeper truth about human nature, right? Change, even positive change, can be frightening.
Yes.
It disrupts the familiar, challenges our assumptions, and forces us to confront the unknown.
So what ultimately happens to our protagonist?
all.
Does he manage to convince anyone of what he's seen?
Sadly, no.
Does he start a revolution?
He's ultimately labeled a heretic and imprisoned by the ruling circles for spreading his dangerous knowledge.
Wow, talk about adding insult to injury.
I know.
Not only is he rejected and ridiculed, but he's also locked up for daring to expand people's horizons.
It's a sobering reminder of the power structures that often work to maintain the status quo, even at the expense of truth and progress.
Right.
You know, those in power often feel threatened by new ideas.
Yeah.
Especially those that challenge their authority.
So our poor protagonist ends up like a martyr for the cause of...
It seems that way.
higher understanding.
It is on the surface.
That's a pretty bleak ending.
It is on the surface, but even in prison, the protagonist doesn't give up hope.
Okay.
He continues to believe that one day others will see the truth of what he's experienced.
That's the spirit. He embodies that unwavering belief in truth and the power of knowledge, even when faced with overwhelming opposition.
Exactly. And in that sense, his story is both tragic and hopeful. Tragic in that he suffers for his insights, but hopeful in his enduring faith in the power of truth to eventually break through the barriers of ignorance and fear.
So we've journeyed through this strange and wonderful world of Flatland.
We have.
We've explored its rigid social hierarchy.
Yes.
We followed our protagonist on his mind-bending adventure to Spaceland.
Right.
But before we sign off, I want to bring it back to us here.
Okay.
In our own three-dimensional world.
Right.
What are the big takeaways for us? How can we apply the lessons of Flatland to our own lives?
I think the most important lesson is the importance of staying curious, challenging our own assumptions, and always being open to the possibility that there might be more to reality than we currently understand.
It's like that saying, the more you know, the more you realize you don't know.
Precisely. Flatland reminds us that knowledge is a journey, not a destination. There's always more to learn.
Yes.
More to explore, more to understand.
And it also reminds us that the pursuit of knowledge can be dangerous.
It can.
Especially when it challenges those in power.
Absolutely. But even in the face of opposition, we must never stop seeking the truth, questioning the status quo, and expanding our understanding of ourselves and the universe we inhabit.
Beautifully said.
Thank you.
Well, that brings us to the end of our deep dive into Flatland. I don't know about you, but I feel like I've gained a whole new perspective on things.
As you should. Flatland is a book that stays with you long after you've finished reading it.
Yes.
It's a timeless exploration of the limitations of perception, the power of knowledge, and the human spirit's unyielding quest for truth.
And on that note, we encourage you, our listeners, to seek out Edwin Abbott's Flatland and embark on your own intellectual adventure. You might be surprised at what you discover about yourself and the world around you.
Until next time, stay curious.